The terrifying true story behind Jigsaw didn't begin with a mask, a puppet, or a bloody game. It began with a man who walked among us. Not an actor, not a character, but someone who truly believed in testing human will through suffering. And his story is far more disturbing than any film could ever capture. He wasn't called Jigsaw. That was Hollywood's creation. But his obsession with control, punishment, and survival, that was very real. To understand him, we must go back to the late 1970s, a time when America was drowning in fear. Serial killers were no longer myths. They were neighbors, co-workers, smiling strangers. In the Midwest, whispers spread of a man who didn't kill in anger. He killed in method. He killed in lessons. He believed the people he chose had wasted their lives, and he was determined to fix that. Authorities didn't know his name. They didn't even know if he was one man or many. All they had were scenes, rooms, and the victims he left behind. Some survived, some did not. But all of them said the same thing. He made them play. Small towns near Illinois and Indiana began reporting bizarre disappearances. A teenager on his way home from work, a woman leaving a late-night diner, a drifter stepping off a bus. Most were never found, but a handful came back, and what they told police sounded insane. One man, pale and shaking, claimed he had been locked inside a storage unit with nothing but a dull blade and a padlock chained to his ankle. He said he had 24 hours to escape, or die. Another woman said she woke up in an abandoned farmhouse strapped to a chair with syringes taped to her arms. In front of her, a single note: "Find the key or bleed." Each survivor described the same eerie detail, an almost theatrical cruelty. The rooms were designed, thought out, staged like puzzles, and somewhere in the dark, their tormentor watched. The police dismissed most of these accounts as hallucinations, trauma-driven fabrications. Without bodies, without proof, it was easier to bury the stories than confront them. But the stories never stopped, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every so often, someone desperate enough to survive crawled back from hell, repeating the same twisted narrative. A man who believed suffering created gratitude. Does that sound familiar? It should, because decades later a group of filmmakers would create a villain named John Kramer, the Jigsaw Killer, and his games would terrify the world. But here's the truth they never told you. Kramer was fiction. The blueprint was not. Subscribe if you dare, because the deeper we go, the darker this becomes. The man behind the real games was no mastermind engineer like in the movies. He wasn't building elaborate traps with spinning blades or mechanical jaws. No. His tools were simpler, and perhaps because of that, far more terrifying. Padlocks, syringes, rusted chains, timers stolen from hardware stores. Cheap, ugly, effective. One victim described a room with only 2 doors, one locked, one rigged. He was told to choose, but if he picked wrong, a shotgun shell wired to the handle would end him instantly. He guessed correctly. Others weren't so lucky. You might think this is an urban legend, a campfire story to scare teenagers. But records from small-town police departments confirm strange reports of survival scenarios in abandoned buildings between 1978 and 1983. They never linked them together, never admitted the possibility of a single architect. But the victims knew. They said he spoke softly, almost politely, never screaming, never cursing, just telling them they were wasting their lives. And now, they had a chance to prove otherwise. Imagine the terror. Not a faceless monster, not a man with a knife, but someone who thinks he's giving you a gift, someone who watches you crawl through broken glass, choke on fear, and bleed for survival, and calls it redemption. Would you beg? Would you fight? Would you cut your own flesh just to walk free? If you've made it this far, like this video to let me know you're still with me in the dark, because what comes next is worse. The more the mysterious tormentor operated, the more confident he became. He began leaving messages, not just to his victims but to the authorities. Notes scrawled on dirty paper, phrases like, "You only value life when it's almost taken from you. Recognize it." It's almost word for word what Jigsaw would say in the films decades later. But this was real. The FBI quietly investigated, but without fingerprints, without photographs, they had nothing. All they had were survivors scarred in ways no therapy could mend. One man gouged out his own eye to escape a shackle driven through his skull. Another severed 3 fingers to free his hand from a vice. They lived, but they never truly lived again. Because in their nightmares, he was still watching. By the mid-1980s, the trail went cold. No more survivors, no more games. Had he stopped? Had he died? Or had he simply learned how to hide his victims better? No one knows. But the legend of the nameless tormentor grew. And in Hollywood, whispers turned into scripts. Writers drew on urban legends, true crime, and survivor tales until fiction blurred with reality. And when Saw premiered in 2004, audiences recoiled at the horror of Jigsaw. But for some, it wasn't entertainment. It was memory, because they had lived it. And they knew. The real story had only just begun. The films gave him a name. Jigsaw, a man of traps and choices, of blood and revelation. But the real figure who inspired him was never caught, never unmasked, never placed in handcuffs for the world to see. And that's what makes his shadow even more terrifying. Because unlike the movies, there was no tape recorder explaining the rules. No dramatic reveal of a mastermind with a tragic backstory. There was only silence, a door that slammed shut, and the knowledge that you had been chosen. Some researchers believe he was a drifter. Others argue he must have been someone with medical knowledge, someone who understood the human body well enough to inflict pain without immediate death. One theory suggests he worked in construction, giving him access to abandoned properties where his games could play out unnoticed. But the truth is, no one knows. What they do know is this: his victims were never random. Each survivor described the same pattern. He targeted people he believed were wasting their lives: addicts, thieves, people drowning in debts or vices, people who, in his eyes, needed punishment to wake up. One woman claimed she had been hooked on painkillers when she was taken. She woke up in a filthy basement with a scalpel in one hand and a locked steel box chained to her leg. Inside the box, she was told, was her freedom. But the lock could only be opened with a key surgically embedded beneath her own skin. She cut. She screamed. She survived. And years later, when she saw the film Saw for the first time, she fainted in the theater. Because what had been presented as fiction was the exact nightmare she had lived. The filmmakers denied knowing anything about a real-world case. They insisted it was coincidence inspired only by imagination and horror tropes. But the overlap was undeniable. The traps, the philosophy, the calm voice insisting that through suffering came salvation. And then came something chilling. After the release of the first film, police in 3 different states reported receiving anonymous letters. The words were scrawled in jagged handwriting. The message the same each time: "You made me into entertainment." Whoever had written them knew, but he wasn't writing to confess. He was writing to gloat. If you're listening right now, think about that. Somewhere, perhaps still alive, is a man who sat in the dark and watched the world turn his crimes into a box office sensation. A man who may have smiled in the theater as audiences gasped at what they thought was fiction. Tell me, does that thought chill you? If it does, share this video, because the story deserves to be heard. The story needs to be remembered. The trail of the real Jigsaw has grown faint with time, but the scars remain. Survivors who lived through his sadistic games rarely spoke publicly. Some turned to religion. Some vanished into obscurity. A few took their own lives, unable to bear the memory of what they had endured. One detective who had interviewed survivors in the early 80s described their eyes as haunted forever. He said they didn't just fear the man who had captured them. They feared what they themselves had done to survive. That was his true cruelty. He didn't just test their will. He forced them to see what they were capable of when stripped of choice. And isn't that more terrifying than the films? Not a slasher, not a monster with a mask, but a human being who turned morality into a weapon. As the years passed, the whispers faded, but every so often something stirs them again. A hiker stumbles on a shack in the woods with chains bolted to the floor. An abandoned farmhouse is found with graffiti reading, "Live or die, the choice is yours." Teenagers tell stories of a figure who lingers in small Midwestern towns, watching, waiting, deciding. Authorities dismiss these claims. They say they are urban legends born from pop culture. But the few who know the old files, the ones buried deep in dusty police archives, aren't so sure. Imagine for a moment that he is still alive. An old man now, perhaps gray and quiet. He could be sitting in a diner, sipping coffee, listening to the news. He could be living in the house next door. And maybe, just maybe, he still believes in his twisted philosophy. Maybe he's waiting for the world to grow complacent again. Maybe he's waiting for the right victim. And maybe he never stopped. We like to think that monsters belong on screens, that when the credits roll, the nightmare ends. But the terrifying truth is that the real Jigsaw never needed cameras or scripts. He only needed a locked door, a set of chains, and time. And somewhere out there, he could be listening now. If you're brave enough, comment below. Would you survive one of his games? Or would you break before the clock ran out? Because survival was never about strength. It was about will, about how much pain you could endure before you lost yourself. The fictional Jigsaw may be a legend of horror cinema, but the true story behind him, the man who believed suffering was salvation, that is no legend. That is history. And history has a way of repeating itself. So the next time you hear about an abandoned house on the edge of town, or you walk past a padlock on a rusted basement door, ask yourself, is it just neglect? Or something much darker? Remember, evil doesn't vanish when the credits roll. It lingers. It waits. It feeds on our disbelief. And if the real Jigsaw is still out there watching, smiling, planning, then perhaps the game never ended. It only paused. Until it's your turn. If this story unsettled you, subscribe for more chilling truths hidden in plain sight. Like this video to keep the shadows alive, and comment below what you would do if you woke up in one of his rooms. Because in the end, you might not have a choice, and neither did they.